I just want to start by thanking the incredible women who are sharing their stories at the LEAD conference. Thank you all. It's been incredible to hear from you and sit at your feet this morning. Wally was born in 1968 into an unstable family. His dad wasn't very present, and his siblings all got into trouble. He never had consistent family that knew how to show him love. And this was all complicated when Wally was 6 months old. He had a series of seizures that resulted in serious damage to his brain. As a result, Wally had limited physical and intellectual development. When I met Wally, he used a wheelchair and was completely nonverbal except for a handful of words. I met Wally because my wife, Leah, worked at the L'Arche community in Mobile, Alabama. If you don't know, L'Arche is an international network of communities with people of various abilities and disabilities that live in intentional community together. Leah got to know Wally through the ordinary routines of life in community. She took him to the bathroom, she took him on walks, she talked to him, she made lunch for Wally, and she ate with him. And they became friends over time through these routines. Now, when I saw all that Wally was capable of, I began to understand that ability and disability are constructions of our society. An ability is anything anyone is able to do. Wally was considered disabled, but he had so many abilities. He was able to feed himself. He was also able to smack you if you tried to make him do anything he didn't want to do. Wally could also communicate with a few words, but because he only had a few, he had to let his few words cover a lot of ground. Wally would say, yes, if he was happy. If he was sad, he would say, I don't want it. He could also say racket, as in, John is making a racket. He could say the name of his favorite color, blue. And if he was feeling sweet, he could muster a soft, I love you. Wally really put his words to work. How are you doing today, Wally? I don't want it. Do you like your food? Yes. What is John doing over there? Racket. I love you, Wally. Love you. The concept of disability is not inherent to the human condition. Our society determines what it means to be disabled. For instance, I wear glasses like a lot of you do. My eyes don't work at their full potential. I have a disability in my eyes. But most people would not consider me to be disabled. However, some disabilities are perceived by our society with extra weight, with extra implications. In our world, using a wheelchair might mean that you're disabled, but using an elevator means that you're tired. Consider it this way: if every door frame in the world was 5 feet tall, everyone taller than 5 feet would have a hard time meandering through life. Everything would be more difficult. In the same way, because the world is filled with stairs and raised ledges and narrow doorways, it is hard for people with different abilities to get through spaces. We consider it a disability because a person in a chair does not fit in our world. But if every doorway was wide and had a ramp, someone in a chair would not be considered disabled in the same way. They would be much more abled. The problem is, of course, not that people are disabled. The problem is that the world creates situations that make everything harder to access for people with diverse abilities. Everyone has abilities and disabilities. I am abled in certain ways. I'm able to walk and I can talk using the English language. However, I am not able to do math. I literally have panic attacks if I have to do more than simple calculations. My 9-year-old is already passing me in mathematic ability. As a child, I spent hours sobbing because I couldn't understand my math homework. I legitimately am disabled in mathematics, but my friend Mark, who is considered autistic, is a genius in math. If you tell him your birthday, for me, July 29th, 1986, he can tell you what day of the week it was, a Tuesday. But Mark has a hard time communicating verbally. We both have a wide range of abilities. This is true for all of us. We are who we are. Some are tall, some are short, some are athletic, some are artistic, some use chairs, some walk, some love crowds, some love isolation. We are all differently abled. And as I got to know Wally and a community of people with a wide range of abilities, I began to understand the image of God from a completely different perspective. See, I had always been taught that the image of God was something inside each of us. God made human beings and put a little bit of God inside each of us. And over again, I've heard different people try to explain what that little piece of God is that we all have in common. I've heard some say that intellect and a capacity for reasoning are the image of God in human beings. Others have suggested that the ability to create life is the image of God. Some have even said that the capacity to care for others is the image of God. But the problem with trying to nail down one characteristic in human beings that is like God is that human beings have a very diverse expression of personhood. No one person thinks like every other person. Not every person has the ability to create life. Not every person has the ability to love in the same way that we all want to be loved. Does that mean that the people who are exceptions to the rule aren't made in God's image? Of course not. So I sought to reclaim a concept of the image of God that included everyone. I sought to get out of the idea that someone could identify a common factor in human beings and deduce the image of God. That's impossible because there is always an exception to the rule. And if there's an exception, there's not a rule. The image of God isn't some common trait we all share. Rather, we are all the image of God. We are all God's image reflecting back to heaven. I like to imagine it like an infinite divine mosaic. God's picture is this expansive and massive thing that can't be contained by human reason or perception. But the picture is made up of tiny little blocks of color. That's us. We are all different colors, shapes, and textures. We're all little pieces of this infinite picture, and each tiny piece of the picture is crucial because the picture wouldn't be the same without you. This has been a huge realization for me as I've navigated my own mental health issues. In seminary, I was diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety disorders. Before the diagnosis, I knew I was depressed, but I saw my mental health issues as something that I had to overcome. If I was going to make it in this world, I was going to have to suck down all of the feelings, insecurities, all the pain. I actually once had a pastor decide that it was his job to make me grow thick skin. He thought that I would need to toughen up if I was going to be a leader. So he would be particularly hard on me, picking apart my ideas, making me feel small. What he didn't realize is that it was actually making everything much harder for me, much more difficult, much more painful. That pastor's voice has echoed in my head for years. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You don't need to be so emotional. But then I got this diagnosis. And all of a sudden, I had an explanation for why I could never measure up to this pastor's voice in my head. I wasn't broken, lazy, or sinful. I was me. And in the years since I received that diagnosis, I have learned how to think of myself as beautiful, strong, and worthy. I was created in God's image. My depression is part of who I am, and that part of me is valuable. That part of me is capable. That part of me deserves to be loved. And in the Jubilee worship service at our church, I have found a place to be myself in worship. I found a place where I could manage my anxiety because there's no expectations for worship to be a production. We have no pace. We let worship rise up organically from who we are. We follow a liturgy, but oftentimes we deviate because of the people involved in leading it. Sometimes people shout and talk during the sermon. Sometimes people drop the communion plates. We let people be who they are. We let who they are direct the flow of worship. And because of this, we see beauty, authenticity, and vulnerability in everything we do. We are just people giving our personal offerings of praise to a God who loves us. Jean Vanier talks a lot about vulnerability. He says that human beings need to be vulnerable with each other so that we can learn to be ourselves. He points out that the great sin of free market capitalism is that people are reduced to commodities. They are given value based on their productivity, their strength, and their stamina. And when your value is based on your productivity, there is no room for weakness. There's no room for human beings to be themselves, beautiful, tender, and vulnerable. But the world doesn't have to be that way. The Jubilee service is teaching our church, it's teaching me, it's teaching our community to be vulnerable. About 2 years ago, Wally went into the hospital with severe pneumonia. Even though he didn't have much family, he always had a L'Arche employee there with him around the clock, just sitting there with him, advocating for him and sharing the gift of presence. When you're mostly nonverbal, hospitalization is tricky because you can't say where it hurts. So the doctors had a hard time figuring out that Wally had an infection. His lungs got worse, and finally, Leah got the call that we had been dreading. So we went to see Wally that day. The nurse said that he had been in a bad mood. He hadn't been saying too much yes. He'd been saying a lot of, I don't want it. He'd been pulling at his IV and had been weakly trying to hit anyone who came too close. When we got there, Wally had a hard time focusing on us. We said hello and asked his caretaker a few questions. Then Leah leaned in close. She whispered in his ear, "Hey, Wally." His eyes immediately lit up. Yes. I asked Wally if I could pray for him. Yes. Then, as I was praying for God to prepare Wally's soul for eternity, he said it once again. Yes. We said amen, started to say our last goodbyes, and Leah said, "Wally, I love you." And Wally slowly turned his head towards her voice. "I love you." Every person's life is a beautiful expression of God's love and God's image.